going to move on to the next speaker now. I think he's ready. He looks ready to me. His name is Pascal Markus Lemmer. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname right. And he will be talking about the problem or potential impossibility of formalizing metaphors. So Pascal, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Hi, can you all hear me all right? Great. Hi. Well, thank you very much for having me. Especially having recently graduated from my master's in philosophy and being a clinician in training, but not a linguist, I feel greatly honored to be here and actually present my argument not only to the people working in the field, but apparently also to the very person whose use I am considering. So that's extra exciting. I would like to today propose 2 propositions on metaphor, essentially. But the slides isn't working, is it? Ah, yes. Okay, today I would like to make 2 propositions about metaphor. For one, I would like to argue that metaphor and its properties cannot at the same time be part of a continual view of language and metaphor and be considered categorically distinct. And secondly, I would like to argue that functional explanations of metaphor, for example, by means of a cognitive account, are categorically different from a definition of formalisation. On the premise of these 2 propositions, I will state a certain problem, if not impossibility, of formalizing metaphor within the context of relevance theory that goes deeper than what Wilson and Carston have called the challenge of non-propositional effects in their 2019 paper. But more about that later. I will proceed now in 3 steps. First, I will introduce what the French philosopher Jacques Derrida has called the law of supplementarity regarding metaphor and derive from it the 2 propositions I just mentioned. In the second part of my talk, I will try to give a brief but general outline of the problem of accounting for metaphor as I have encountered it in the literature, especially regarding what has been called imagistic or creative metaphors. Subsequently, I will demonstrate how these 2 propositions relate to a recent model of metaphor and highlight unresolved tensions within it. At the very end, I will elaborate on what I think this means regarding the challenge of non-propositional effects. So let's get into it. Derrida, as I said, my 2 propositions are derived from what Derrida has called the law of supplementarity regarding metaphor, as developed in his essay, White Metaphor, Metaphor in the Text of Philosophy. If it were a simple law, like for example, Newton's law of gravity, I would happily quote it for you. Sadly, that is not the case. The best that I can do is to tell you that Derrida speaks of an interminable dehiscence of the concept and the field of metaphor as viewed in its formal necessity. And already a lot is going on there. First of all, Derrida implies the duality of the concept of metaphor and its field. The field of metaphor denotes something like the set of all empirical metaphors, or what you might call extension in linguistics. Secondly, it states that field and concept of metaphor dehisce or diverge, which means they are not identical. And this non-identity is understood to be a formal necessity and not a contingent feature. Thirdly, and please excuse the brute language, where there is a dehiscence, there is an underlying tissue, and most importantly, the flesh from which both are made. In other words, the field and the concept of metaphor have a shared root and they depend on one another in Derrida's view. But where does this dehiscence come from? Well, Derrida arrives at this law by a kind of 2-fold argumentation. He examines the relationship between rhetoric as a taxonomy of tropes and philosophy as the domain of knowledge where things' essential properties are unveiled. By doing so, he arrives at 2 conclusions. First, he argues that no set of metaphors can ever amount to a concept of metaphor, at least in the ontological sense. In the same vein, no iteration of the concept of metaphor can exhaustively describe the field of metaphors. What both have in common is that the link between concept and field of metaphor is mediated by binary oppositions, which are ultimately either empirically and or theoretically inadequate or incomplete. However, the field and the concept of metaphor also need each other. There is no concept of metaphor without a field that it represents, nor can we speak of metaphor and its field without having a concept of it. And this interrelation and interdependence is what Derrida means when he speaks of supplementarity. Metaphor and its concept, the empirical field of metaphor and the concept of metaphor are closely related. They are necessary for each other. They can never be identical, but they can never be identical or in complete congruence. The latter also implies that there can never be a concept of metaphor that is both empirically and formally complete and consistent. If Derrida is right, at least one of these properties, so empirical completeness and consistency or formal completeness and consistency, will ultimately prove either illusory or provisional. What that means for the concept of metaphor is the following. Philosophy, or indeed any science that seeks to define metaphor, in Derrida's words, could perceive its metaphorics only around a blind spot, sorry, that's a typo, a blind spot or central deafness. The concept of metaphor would describe this contour, but it is not even certain that the concept thereby circumscribes an organizing center. The philosopher will never find in this concept anything but what he has put into it. What I take this to mean is that there is no fixed concept of metaphor upon which a theory could be built, but also that theories cannot operate with a fixed concept of metaphor just like that. Rather, the difference, but that also means that the difference between concept and field is not fixed either. The form that this dehiscence takes depends on the context in which it is encountered. And what I mean by that is that the precise shape of the sort of blind spot that is the concept of metaphor depends on which empirical phenomena are being described and which theoretical concepts are employed, which we will see in a second. However, this is why I believe that the law of supplementarity can be translated into the somewhat more specific propositions that I mentioned in the beginning and which I want to discuss in detail now. My first proposition is that metaphor and its properties cannot at the same time be part of a view of language and metaphor as continual and be considered categorically distinct. This, by the way, is true regardless of whether one assumes one overarching continuum of language, like the use-lose-use continuum, or considers a continuum of different kinds of properties of metaphor under one concept of metaphor. Arguing the first case, I'm saying that this is because this would suppose the partial identity of the concepts of language and metaphor. Yet, even if the assumption of the partial identity of language and metaphor is warranted, this would hardly help explain the conceptual specificity of metaphor. In turn, this contradicts the very purpose of a concept or explanation of metaphor, as it ought to provide insight into that which makes metaphors specifically. If this specificity is not clarified, such a formalization of metaphor would not provide much conceptual insight, nor, in fact, would it likely be very informative regarding empirical metaphors. Furthermore, to my mind, assuming both the difference in degree and the difference in kind is internally inconsistent with each other, if not outright contradictory. My second proposition is that a functional explanation, for example, by means of a cognitive account of metaphor, is not the same thing as a definition or formalization of metaphor. This proposition can be considered a special case of the difference that Derrida found between the field and the concept of metaphor. However, it might be a bit more controversial than my first proposition, because I assume in translating it this way, that a functional account of metaphor is an empirical description of metaphor rather than a conceptual definition. For the purpose of this talk, however, I would like you to assume that this is the case, and I will believe this will become more plausible when we look at an example. In this case, it becomes clear that a functional explanation of metaphor does not by itself offer any insight into the conceptual nature of metaphor. Hence, it cannot be used to draw conceptual distinctions between metaphor and other forms of speech. What it may do is it may hope to supplement and engage in a productive relationship with the concept of metaphor, but it will never be able to replace it. Ultimately, this leads to a kind of problem of formalisation. Even access to, like hypothetical access to the entire empirical field of metaphors would not yield a conclusive description of its conceptual properties, and vice versa. And as I will demonstrate now, I believe this is readily observable in the current debate on metaphor, too, if one just knows what to look for. And this is how I will come to what I believe is the relevance of my proposition in relevance theory. As a short outline, one important point about metaphor in pragmatic linguistics was whether they were in some sense abnormal, as Grice held, or indeed as natural, normal, and pervasive, as Robyn Carston and many other relevance theorists believe. As Carston put it, at least in cognitively oriented pragmatics, the latter view is now almost universally adopted. However, that doesn't mean that the trouble stops here. Something about metaphor seems to remain elusive, even to relevance theory today. Indeed, as recently as 2019, Wilson and Carston have pointed out that non-propositional effects still pose a challenge to relevance theory. In their own words, relevance theory does not yet have the formal tools to do justice to the richness and variety of non-propositional effects, with potentially serious implications for the boundaries of pragmatics. Wilson and Carston's admission comes after more than a decade of work in relevance theory, in which many attempts had been made to include metaphor in pragmatic linguistics. In the wake of Sperber and Wilson's 2008 deflationary account of metaphor, Carston specifically sought to explain what she had coined at different times extended, imagistic, or creative metaphors. With these terms, she tries to get a grasp on those metaphors which are not exhaustively described by the semantics of relevance theory, but whose impact on the addressee is largely mediated by non-propositional effects. Rather than effacing metaphors distinctive, as Sperber and Wilson willfully do, Carston affirms it and explains it by means of the very non-propositional effects which remain a challenge to pragmatics today, and notably to the phenomenon of mental imagery. However, this specificity of metaphor means that the functional accounts that relevance theory had offered so far for most other kinds of speech do not apply to metaphor. Hence, Carston went on to do what relevance theory arguably does best. She attempted to find a functional explanation of how such metaphors work. Ideally, this would enable her to integrate these kinds of metaphors into the existing cognitive framework of relevance theory. A very good example of such an account, I believe, is the one that Carston proposed in her 2010 paper, Metaphor, Ad Hoc Concepts, Literal Meaning, and Mental Images. Even though she published what could be considered a revision of this account in 2018, I will be discussing the account of metaphor she proposes earlier here. In short, I do so because I believe that the revisions later do not change the underlying conceptual problem, which is easier to show in this paper. In the conception of 2018, Carston starts out by making a distinction between conventional single-worded metaphors on the one hand and literary, extended, highly imagistic metaphors on the other. She notes that this is a clustering of properties which may make it seem as if that were two kinds of metaphor, like for example, ordinary and literary, or single and extended, but that one should not expect a single account of metaphor that applies to both. And what I believe that she means by account here is concept. While she does not assume that the distinction is clear-cut in the realm of account, like in the conceptual realm, she proposes a kind of dual processing theory of metaphor, a quick local online meaning adjustment process, the kinds of which are like everywhere in pragmatic linguistics now, and a slower, more global appraisal of the literal meaning of the whole through a slow, deliberative processing route. By taking this position, she wants to argue against some aspects of both the proposition view and the image view of metaphor. The proposition view holds that the meaning of a metaphor, roughly, lies primarily in what the intended in the intended propositional content. Proponents on the image view, on the contrary, like Davidson and the McGinn, who was mentioned just now, are taken to hold that what a metaphor does is, at least primarily, not propositional in nature. Propositional views are the most common or obvious way to account for most kinds of language. But what I think that Carston values about image views is that they seek to hold space for and at the same time explain what makes metaphor special. What is at stake for Carston is a unified theory of metaphor which does justice both to the tremendous explanatory power of propositional views and the distinctive or special properties attributed to metaphor. Her strategy, in my view, is not to reconcile these views by mapping onto them two distinct kinds of metaphor, again, something like ordinary and literal metaphors, or deciding in favor of one or the other. Again, she argues explicitly against such a conceptual distinction. Rather, this division is relocated into the realm of functional explanations and mirrored or represented by the two processing routes. However, there remains an irresolvable tension between the image view and the propositional view regarding, in short, whether metaphor is ultimately best explained in propositional terms or not. Carston, however, remains committed to not fall into the trap of an either-or conception. Rather, she holds that both kinds of metaphors are processed in both ways and share the respective properties that arise through both representational routes. As she says, it is all a matter of relative weighting of the two routes of processing and the resulting differences in degree between more conventional and more literary metaphors. In very literary metaphors, as limiting cases, when there is no propositional meaning to be inferred, the first route of processing may not work as usual. But then the second takes over, ensuring an explanatory and conceptual continuity. But what I think what is quite apparent in this account is that Carston is trying to turn the difference in kind between propositional and imagistic properties of metaphor into a matter of relative weightings and a difference in degree. To my mind, the significance of this cannot be overstated. Carston attempts to find a unified explanation of metaphor, but in the end, she's forced to concede that, I quote, "it remains to be seen whether there is a property of metaphoricity at all. That is, whether it is possible to define or formalize metaphor as such." Hence, I argue that her unified theory of metaphor, strictly speaking, offers no insight into the conceptual nature or specificity of metaphor vis-a-vis other forms of speech. This is, of course, not a definitive proof that the formalization of metaphor is impossible in this way, but Carston's attempt at integrating views which conceive of metaphor as different in kind and different in degree within one unified concept of metaphor seems problematic, if not impossible, even though she has allocated these differences to lay on different levels. This brings me, well, this was regarding primarily my first proposition. This brings me to my second proposition. I believe that Carston's account also shows that a functional explanation of metaphor does not amount to a concept of it. Assuming that Carston's functional explanation is more or less correct, it became apparent that it does not lead her closer to a concept of metaphor. It leads her further away. The properties that she ascribes to metaphor in the course of this paper are grounded in her account of how metaphor is processed. But, as she herself states, they are not specific to metaphor. This is why I hold that the functional explanation she offers cannot compensate for the conceptual difficulties. As a theory of metaphor, it is internally consistent, if not contradictory, and does not produce any insight into the nature of metaphor. It is more akin to a particular way of, and functional explanations entirely are more akin to a particular way of delineating the empirical field of metaphor and are not a formal description of what metaphor is, necessarily so. It ascribes properties to metaphor, but strictly speaking, it can only grant them in how metaphors are ostensibly understood, not the nature of metaphor itself, and certainly not in how metaphor is understood differently from other forms of language, Not last, because it seems that metaphor is not understood differently from other forms of language. I'm just realizing that this slide made much more sense when I was had a longer blog quote before, so I'm very sorry for putting that out. I can show it to you in the Q&A though. Also, yes, I will be ending now. I will be coming to the challenge of non-propositional effects and the problem of formalization. As I mentioned earlier, this is still an unresolved issue, this being the challenge of non-propositional effects or the question of metaphor. The focus now lies less on the concept of metaphor, on more on finding an explanation or formalization of non-propositional effects. Given what had just happened to the concept of metaphor, that it suddenly became unclear whether it even existed, this may perhaps not be entirely surprising. However, to me, the underlying issue remains the same. There is a propositional view of language and metaphor that relevance theory is wedded to. I think it lies at the heart of central concepts of Spurgeon and Wilson's, like ostensive communication and especially manifestness. As long as they remain essentially untouched, relevance theory depends on the propositional nature of meaning for its theory of communication. That is the reason why non-propositional effects pose a challenge to relevance theory in the first place. I will be done in 1 minute, sorry. Wilson and Carston seem to believe that this is only a matter of time, and that it is only a matter of time until formal tools to deal with non-propositional effects are available. I, on the other hand, believe there is a lesson to be learned from Carston's earlier attempts. As long as prospective new conceptions of metaphor do not take into account the insights I derived from Derrida's law of supplementarity, I believe they are poised to repeat past mistakes. They might seek to give a formal description of metaphor by means of a functional account without gaining insight into the conceptual nature of metaphor. Or they might try to conceive of metaphor as a distinct form of speech while attempting to integrate it into a broader theory of language, however, thereby erasing metaphor specificity. This is why I think the challenge of non-propositional effects goes deeper than just a search for new tools. New approaches to the formalization of metaphor are needed. And even should it be true that Derrida's law is not as formally necessary as he says, I believe it can and should prompt important insights into which possible routes to take may prove to be a dead end again and again. Thank you very much. This was my talk.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you very much for such an informative presentation.
Any questions from the floor? Robyn, yes, go ahead. Hopefully your mic works now.
I can't hear her. Can you hear her?
No.
I'm so sorry. Thank you for being here, though.
Robyn, you might want to type your question on the chat. Maybe that would be an option. Meanwhile, maybe do we have any other questions while Robyn types her comments or questions in the chat? Well, I'm not very familiar with metaphors myself or the non-propositional effects that relevance theory discusses. But I found very interesting that idea of moving away from the kind of difference or the difference in kind towards some differences in degree between propositional and imagistic properties of metaphors. And I was wondering if you could perhaps talk about a bit more what these differences in degree, what they would look like.
Sorry, could you repeat the last sentence?
Yeah, so what would the differences in degree between propositional and imagistic properties of metaphor would look like?
Right. Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, it is sort of well, I don't know, but what I think about this from a conceptual view is that there is kind of also an irresolvable tension between accounts that, or between a sort of difference in degree and a difference in kind, because or to say it differently, I don't think you can move away from difference in kind entirely, because then it doesn't make sense to speak of metaphor anymore, right? You need a difference in kind if you want a concept of metaphor. But of course also, but probably the successful integration of metaphor into any theory requires that we find an account of like that does difference in degree, otherwise you just have absolute difference. So I don't know, I've been thinking about this a lot while researching this, and I think the answer is like sort of conceptual tools which allow for both at the same time, without trying to erase either, or trying to very neatly map one kind of difference to one realm, for example, the functional, while then saying, okay, on a conceptual level, we only have a difference in degree. However, what that could look like, I'm equally puzzled.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have any questions? There you go, Robyn. Okay, so Robyn says, my comment would be too long for chat, really. One thing to say is that we were not looking to formalize metaphor, but commenting on why many pragmaticists do not study metaphor with its vague indeterminacy effects, precisely because these are not formalizable. We were arguing that we can still study metaphor insightfully using the tools of cognitive grammatics such as in relevance theory. I have never looked for a concept of metaphor. My work is oriented to giving an account of processing comprehension of metaphor.
I don't think I got that entirely. I can't see it in the chat either. Could you maybe forward it to me? Even Absolutely. If I, yeah, cool, thanks. Even if I like can't answer to it right now, I would love to think about this.
I'll just put it for everyone to see, actually.
Yes. Right. I mean, I would have to think about this, obviously, but what I think, I mean, so what I think is that when you make such, to the extent that like I can even be the judge of that, I think you, Ms. Carston, are entirely right about that. But I don't think like it's a matter of even speaking or even writing these papers or even speaking of metaphor. You have to have some kind of concept of metaphor operative in the kind of propositions that you make, even about how it may be understood, or what is metaphor if we refer to in a sentence like metaphor is understood by being that. But I agree, I'm also very, this doesn't, maybe this didn't really come across in my presentation as it is now, but I'm very sympathetic to what you're doing, because I think it's really great and like already such an advancement, if compared to other conceptions of metaphor before, or like non-conceptions of metaphor like crisis. So I think that it is really great what you're doing. I would just like to sort of, from a philosophical point of view, argue that there is like certain strategies of accounting for metaphor that are conceptually problematic. But anyway, thank you very much for your comment.
Great, thank you. We might have time for one more question, if anyone is up for it. Okay, I think Robyn has written another comment in the chat, so saying, in fact, you have presented my dual road approach more accurately than people usually do, both propositional and imagistic, which is absolutely great to hear, I'm sure.
Yeah, thanks. If you would like, I could just answer in more detail to your original comment in an email.
Great. Okay, so if we don't have any further questions, I want to thank you, Pascal, again for such an amazing talk that you have given. And we are going to proceed to our next